Sarah's world shattered in an instant. Standing on the deck of the luxury cruise ship, her hands trembling as she balanced a tray of champagne flutes, she froze. Time seemed to stand still as her eyes locked onto a familiar face, a face she thought she'd never see again. There, lounging in a plush chair, laughing with a beautiful woman by his side, was Michael. Her husband, the man she had mourned for 7 long years. The man who was supposed to be dead. The shock hit her like a physical blow, nearly causing her to drop the tray. How was this possible? Michael had died in a car accident, his body swept away by the river, never to be found. She had grieved, struggled, and fought to keep their family afloat in his absence. And yet, here he was, very much alive and seemingly without a care in the world. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The past 7 years flashed before her eyes, the endless nights of worry, the constant fear of debt collectors, the sacrifices she had made to give their children a semblance of a normal life. All of it based on a lie. As she stood there, frozen in disbelief, the memories of a happier time washed over her. 7 years earlier, Sarah had never felt happier. The news of her pregnancy had turned her quiet life upside down in the best way possible. Twins. She and Michael had always talked about having a family. But this was beyond what they'd ever dreamed. Sitting in their cozy living room, Sarah watched Michael's eyes light up as she told him the news. His face was a mixture of disbelief and pure joy. Twins? He had asked, his voice cracking with emotion as he ran a hand through his thick, dark hair. We're having twins. She nodded, smiling so widely that her cheeks hurt. Yeah, can you believe it? Michael pulled her into a tight embrace, his breath shaky with excitement. I can't believe this, Sarah. This is everything. Everything. It felt like they were on top of the world. Their small, simple life felt perfect. They lived in a modest home in the suburbs. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. They both worked hard, and even though they didn't have much, they had each other. And now, they had the future they had always dreamed of, a family. For the next week, they were wrapped up in baby names, nursery designs, and planning their new life. Michael joked about learning to change 2 diapers at once, while Sarah made lists of baby clothes and essentials. They had no idea how they were going to afford it all, but that didn't matter. They were happy. And then, just as quickly as the joy had come, it was snatched away. The call came late in the evening when the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the living room. Michael had been out running an errand, picking up some things for dinner, and Sarah had stayed home, her hand absently resting on her still flat belly. She had been thinking about the future, imagining the twins running around their yard, when the phone rang. It was strange. Michael should have been home by now. Hello, she answered, her voice calm, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Mrs. Thompson. The voice on the other end was official, detached. Yes, this is she. Who's calling? I'm calling about your husband, Michael Thompson. There was a pause, just long enough for Sarah's heart to drop. There's been an accident. The words didn't make sense at first. Accident? Michael? Her mind couldn't connect the dots. He had just been out getting groceries. How could there have been an accident? But the voice continued, filling the silence with details she didn't want to hear. His car went off the road. We've searched the area, but we haven't been able to recover his body. For a moment, everything stopped. The room seemed to close in on her, and her breath caught in her throat. No, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I don't understand, Sarah stammered, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean you can't find him? The voice softened slightly, but the words were no less brutal. We believe the current may have taken the car into the river. It's likely the body was swept away. Sarah's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, clutching the phone as if it were her only lifeline. Michael. Gone. Just like that. Her mind screamed that it couldn't be true, that there had to be a mistake, but the official, somber tone on the other end told her otherwise. The days that followed were a blur. There was no closure, no body to bury, nothing to confirm what had happened beyond the words of strangers and the empty space in her life where Michael used to be. Friends and family tried to comfort her, but there were no words that could fill the void. He was gone, and all that remained was the suffocating silence of their once joyful home. And then, just when Sarah thought things couldn't get worse, they did. It started with a knock at the door. She opened it to find a man she didn't recognize, his expression stern and impatient. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. "Yes, I'm here to collect the debt your husband owed." "Debt?" Sarah frowned. "I don't understand. What debt?" The man's lips twisted into a thin, humorless smile. "Your husband owed a substantial amount of money to some, let's say, less forgiving lenders. And now, since he's no longer around to pay it, that responsibility falls to you." Her blood ran cold. Michael had never mentioned any debts. They weren't rich, but they had always made do. How could this be possible? "I don't have any money," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man's smile didn't waver. "That's not my problem. You'll find a way, or else." And with that, he turned and left, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, stunned and terrified. The weight of the world seemed to crush her from all sides. She was pregnant, alone, and now burdened with a debt she had no way of paying. The life she and Michael had dreamed of together was gone, replaced by a nightmare she couldn't escape. As the days dragged on, Sarah tried to stay strong for the sake of her unborn children. But with each passing moment, the reality of her situation became harder to ignore. She was alone, and the world was closing in on her. In the months that followed, Sarah's life became a relentless cycle of fear and exhaustion. The joy she once felt at the thought of becoming a mother was clouded by the crushing weight of the debt Michael had left behind. She had no idea how deep he'd been in, and now, with every passing week, it became painfully clear that she was in way over her head. The phone calls started first. Anonymous, cold voices reminding her of the money she owed. Every time the phone rang, her heart would race, panic seizing her until she mustered the courage to answer. Each conversation was the same. Threatening, impatient demands for payments she couldn't make. Sarah tried to explain, again and again, that she didn't have the money. "I'm pregnant," she'd say, hoping for some shred of compassion. "My husband is gone, and I'm doing my best." But her words fell on deaf ears. To them, she was just another debtor, another name on a list, and every time she hung up, her situation felt even more impossible. The pressure from the loan sharks was relentless. When the calls didn't scare her enough, they escalated. Men started showing up at her door unannounced. She'd open it cautiously, only to be met with cold stares and blunt reminders of the debt. Their presence was suffocating, as if they were waiting. "You have a month," one of them told her after handing her a slip of paper. "Get the money, or we'll make sure you pay another way." Sarah stared at the paper in disbelief. The amount owed was far more than she could ever imagine. It felt like drowning in an ocean with no way out, each wave higher and more merciless than the last. Every time she thought she could catch her breath, the reality of her financial situation hit her harder. Desperate, she took any job she could find. She cleaned houses, worked late nights at local diners, and even did odd jobs for neighbors, all while trying to hide her growing belly. She couldn't afford to slow down, not with the constant threats looming over her. But her body, exhausted and worn, had other plans. One night, as she was scrubbing floors at a small local shop, her vision blurred. She tried to shake it off, but the world around her began to spin. She felt herself sway and grabbed onto the counter to steady herself, but it was no use. The last thing she remembered was the cold tile floor rushing up to meet her before everything went black. When Sarah came to, she was lying in a hospital bed, a nurse checking her vitals. Her heart raced with panic as her hands instinctively went to her belly. The nurse, noticing her distress, placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Your babies are fine," she said softly. "But you're pushing yourself too hard. You need to rest." Rest? The word felt like a cruel joke. How could she rest when her entire life was falling apart? But the nurse's words echoed in her mind. Sarah knew she had to be careful. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her children. With no other choice, Sarah cut back on her hours, which only made things worse. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and the threats from the loan sharks grew more intense. She tried selling what little she had of value, but it barely made a dent. Every penny she earned seemed to disappear into the void of debt, leaving her with nothing. The stress became unbearable. There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she would survive another day. Her mind raced with dark thoughts, doubts creeping in like shadows in the night. She felt trapped, like she was suffocating under the weight of her situation. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered her babies. They were all she had left of Michael, and even though he had left her with this mess, she couldn't abandon them. They were her light in the darkness, the only reason she kept going. By the time her twins were born, Sarah was running on fumes. She held them in her arms, their tiny fingers gripping hers, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of peace. In that hospital room, surrounded by silence, she made a vow. No matter what, she would protect them. She would find a way to survive, even if it meant sacrificing every last part of herself. But reality waited for her outside those hospital doors. The world hadn't changed while she was in the hospital. The loan sharks were still there, waiting for their payment. And now, with 2 mouths to feed, Sarah's situation was even more dire. The fear, once a low hum in the background, became a constant roar in her ears. Weeks turned into months, and Sarah's life continued in a blur of sleepless nights and grueling workdays. Her twins, now crawling and giggling, were the only bright spots in her otherwise bleak existence. But every smile, every laugh was tinged with the ever-present threat hanging over their heads. It wasn't until one particularly bad day, when the phone rang yet again with another demand for payment, that Sarah realized something had to change. She couldn't keep going like this, living in fear, waiting for the next knock at the door. She needed a way out. And when the opportunity finally came, it wasn't in the form of a lifeline, but rather a chance to board a luxury cruise, a job that, while difficult, promised just enough money to pay off the debt that had haunted her for years. It was her only option, and without hesitation, she took it. 7 years had passed, but the weight on Sarah's shoulders hadn't eased. If anything, it had grown heavier. The twins, Jacob and Lily, were now 7 years old, bright-eyed and full of life, completely unaware of the danger that always seemed to lurk in the background. Sarah had done her best to shield them from the harsh reality of their situation, but every day felt like a battle she wasn't sure she could win. Despite working tirelessly at multiple jobs, Sarah had barely made a dent in the debt. The loan sharks were as relentless as ever, showing up at her door or calling her whenever she fell behind on a payment, which seemed to happen more often than not. The threats grew darker, their patience running thin. There were moments when she feared for her life and, worse, for the safety of her children. Sarah knew she couldn't continue living like this. She was worn down, her body exhausted from years of overwork, and the constant fear was starting to take its toll on her mind. The children noticed the bags under her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore, but she couldn't let them know the truth. As far as they were concerned, their mom was strong, always holding everything together, even when it felt like her world was falling apart. One evening, after a long shift at the diner, Sarah sat in her cramped apartment, going over the bills scattered across the table. Her hands trembled as she stared at the numbers that didn't add up. She had enough for rent, but that was it. There would be no money left for food, let alone the next payment to the loan sharks. A knock at the door startled her. She knew who it was before she even answered, her heart racing, fear coiling in her chest as she opened the door a crack. It was one of the men who worked for the loan sharks, a hulking figure with cold eyes that never softened, no matter how much she begged for more time. He was the face she had come to dread, a reminder that the clock was ticking. "You're late again," he said, his voice flat as if they were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "I just need a little more time," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear I'll have the money soon." The man's expression didn't change. "You've been saying that for years, Sarah. The boss is getting tired of waiting." Sarah's throat tightened. She knew what that meant. She had heard stories of people who crossed these men, people who were never seen again. She had always managed to scrape by, always found a way to make just enough to keep them at bay. But she was running out of options. "I have a job lined up," she said quickly, hoping to buy herself more time. "I'm starting in a few days. It's a good one. I'll be able to pay off everything, I promise." The man raised an eyebrow, finally showing a hint of interest. "A job doing what?" Sarah swallowed, her palms sweaty. "It's on a cruise ship. A luxury cruise. I'll be working as a waitress." For the first time, the man seemed to consider her words. "A cruise? That could work. But you better make sure it does, or we'll come collecting. And it won't just be money we take. The implication hung heavy in the air. Sarah nodded quickly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She watched as the man turned and left, her entire body trembling. Once the door clicked shut, the relief was temporary, but it was enough. The job on the cruise had been her lifeline, the only chance she had to get out from under this crushing debt. If she could save up enough during her time at sea, she could finally put an end to this nightmare. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Sarah arranged for her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Reynolds, to watch the twins while she was gone. It broke her heart to leave them, but this was her only chance to secure a future for them. She had no choice. The day she left, Jacob and Lily clung to her, their small arms wrapping around her waist as if they sensed how hard this was for her. "When will you be back, Mommy?" Jacob asked, his brown eyes wide with concern. "In a few weeks," Sarah replied, kneeling down to hug them tightly. "And when I come back, things are going to be better. I promise." Lily, always the quieter of the two, simply nodded and buried her face in Sarah's neck. The lump in Sarah's throat grew as she pulled away, kissing their foreheads before handing them off to Mrs. Reynolds. As she boarded the ship, the enormity of what she was doing began to sink in. This cruise was supposed to be her salvation, but as the massive ship loomed above her, a sense of dread filled her chest. She hadn't been away from the twins for this long since they were born, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The cruise ship itself was a floating palace, gleaming white against the blue of the ocean. Guests in designer clothes strolled along the deck, laughing and sipping champagne, completely oblivious to the struggles of people like Sarah. She donned her uniform and took her place among the staff, her mind focused on the money she desperately needed to make. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. She worked long hours, her feet aching by the end of each shift, but it was a small price to pay for the money she was earning. She kept to herself, avoiding conversations with the other staff,